Good morning to the folks trickling in. We'll be starting in just a minute.
Yep. Thank you for joining us this morning. Good morning, Assemblyman.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning, Assemblyman. We have some folks trickling in. We'll be starting in just a minute.
Great.
Okay, Hannah, I think we're okay.
Yep. Good morning. Thank you for joining us, everyone who's on, and we'll probably have a few more people joining on in the next couple of minutes. My name is Henal Patel. I'm the director of the Democracy and Justice Program at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. The Institute and the League of Women Voters of New Jersey are so happy you are joining us this morning. We are hosting this policy briefing where we have this esteemed group of people with us this morning. So as you know, there is currently a debate, a push happening in New Jersey for same-day voter registration. We know that there's legislative champions, including Assemblyman Mukherji, who's here with us today, really pushing for this. We've also had a number of discussions to figure out how this could work in New Jersey. And in that vein, we wanted to make sure that we're addressing that any questions, concerns, anyone, election officials or legislators might have about how this would actually work in practice. With that in mind, top election officials from Utah and Connecticut have joined us today, and we will introduce them in just a moment. But we are hoping we can have this great discussion and answer any questions anyone has. So with that in mind, please, we are going to be asking some common questions we've received. But if you, during this discussion, have any questions, please use the Q&A function. We will try to get to them during the discussion, or if any of the panelists want to answer them during while this is going on, please feel free to do that as well. So we will begin just in 1 second. I want to make sure everyone's here. So as we before we get to the meat of this, where we talk about the bill, the current bill in New Jersey, A1966, and how same-day registration works in Utah and Connecticut, I wanted to welcome and introduce Acting Secretary Wei, who's here with us this morning. Since 2018, Tahesha Wei has served as New Jersey's 34th Secretary of State. She serves as New Jersey's top election official, overseeing the state division of elections and its work in securing our democracy, ensuring broad, fair access to the right to vote. Acting Secretary of Wei spearheads the New Jersey ballot bill collegiate and high school competition and the New Jersey in Action New Jersey in the Democracy in Action New Jersey initiative to further civic engagement and voter participation. In addition to this, she oversees other state government offices, including arts, culture, history, and business communications. We're so happy to have her here today to begin this panel.
Thanks, Henal, and greetings to all. As Secretary of State, I'm proud of the work we have done the past 4 years to make voting more accessible for New Jersey's eligible voters. We have been so fortunate to have Ryan and his team at the New Jersey Institute of Social Justice and the League of Women Voters of New Jersey, led by Jessie, as our partners in supporting free and fair elections. As election officials, we work closely with our peers from around the country. While our election laws vary from state to state, we experience many of the same challenges, and sharing these in conversation helps strengthen the work we all do for voters. So I would like to welcome the election officials from Utah and Connecticut, Shelly, Scott, and Gabe. Please send my regards to Lieutenant Governor Henderson from Utah, and of course, Secretary of State Denise Merrill, who I have come to know through our National Association of Secretaries of State. And I'm humbled that I will become the first Secretary of State from New Jersey to serve as NAS president this upcoming summer. I must also welcome Assemblyman Raj Mukherji joining today for a discussion on same-day voter registration. That said, I'm grateful to all who showed up today to participate. It is truly inspiring to see how many fellow New Jerseyans are invested in our democracy. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Secretary Wei, and congratulations again. We know you will do New Jersey proud. So before we start, I just wanted to say, part of this discussion, and I know Assemblyman Mukherji shares this, is we recognize that election officials in New Jersey and state legislators, everyone wants to make sure that eligible voters can securely and safely cast their ballot. So this is the foundation of this conversation. How can we make that happen? Everyone here wants to make sure that people can vote. So in mind, I want to introduce Assemblyman Mukherji, who has been championing this effort in New Jersey. Assemblyman Mukherji is a former Marine, a lawyer, and an entrepreneur. He has been representing Legislative District 33 since 2014. He's had a number of roles in the Assembly. In that capacity, including Deputy Whip. Currently, though, he is the Deputy Speaker, the Deputy Parliamentarian, and he also serves as Chair of the Judiciary Committee. He's championed a number of bills and issues during his illustrious career in state government, and including a number of voting bills, specifically same-day voter registration. So I will both turn it over to Assemblyman Mukherji and also ask our first question. Assemblyman, can you share with us what A1966, which is the same-day registration bill, does, the amendments, and why you think it's important for New Jersey to have same-day registration?
Sure. Thank you, Hannah. Well, simply put, A1966 leverages our existing election infrastructure and polling locations and early voting sessions, voting centers, as amended, using the provisional ballots that are already being collected if you show up to vote and you're not registered. And the only difference is now, if you show up on election day, that provisional ballot, which right now acts as your registration for future election, is going to be kept. It allows you to register to vote and vote and participate in your democracy and the democratic process on the same day without an artificial barrier, without a barrier of an artificial deadline to have registered some weeks in advance. That's what the bill does, and I think I'll talk about its importance in response to another question I anticipate, but that's what the bill does.
Thank you so much, Assemblyman. And I will note that I know the Assemblyman has been, one of the reasons it's been amended, as he mentioned, is because to address concerns raised by election officials to make this bill stronger and more effective for the state of New Jersey, which we really appreciate. And I think that's an indication of how important you think this issue is. So, Assemblyman, can you share why you think—
Polite way of saying we took away all the excuses.
Perhaps. I think it's more, but I do think it shows why you think it's so important, which can you share with the group?
Also true, but it really does make it so incredibly easy to implement, because you don't have to do anything. You have to do nothing differently in terms of the infrastructure designed to be able to accommodate what we're going to be doing now.
Thank you. Yes, exactly. So with that in mind, Assemblyman, can you share why you're championing this issue in New Jersey? We have a number of voting bills. We've talked about this. I get these questions sometimes as, why is this important? People can register to vote. They have 3 weeks. We have a 3-week registration deadline in New Jersey. Why can't people just use it?
Sure. Well, the beauty of this is that, no need to reinvent the wheel. This is has been done in 21 states, nearly half the states of our union and the District of Columbia, where some form of same-day voter registration is offered. It has consistently and across the board found to be a safe method of registration. It is not conducive to fraud. Conversely, when you have some jurisdictions, some states in our union at this crossroads in our democracy, where I think that our democratic institutions are at a point of at least being susceptible to deterioration when voting rights are being eroded, and when people of color and certain populations of Americans are having their voting rights overtly and blatantly, without an effort to conceal the motivation, disenfranchised, and they're being purged from voter rolls. And we're trying to make it harder in some of those places for them to vote and participate in their democracy. We have an opportunity to defend democracy, to defend democratic institutions, which are under attack not only here in America, but throughout the world, as we see in Ukraine. And same-day voter registration, we have seen increases turnout by 5%. We're seeing an increase in turnout by 10% in the 18 to 24 demographic, which is an important age group of eligible voters because of the apathy, and particularly because they might not be paying attention until the late stages of the game, when you start to see the commercials really rivet up, getting closer to election day, maybe the last minute mailers that wakes them up to the fact that election day is tomorrow, but I didn't register by October 12th. And is that the population that we want to discourage from voting? So the inequities in our voting system also show people of color register at lower rates than their white counterparts. Black and brown voters are more likely to be purged from voter rolls throughout the country, including here in New Jersey, the data shows, than their white counterparts. People of color move more frequently. Renters, my district has the highest numbers of tenants in the state because we're geographically small, but incredibly densely populated. Not just my current district, but my new district, as a result of redistricting, the new map, the new 32nd, will remain the smallest geographic district in the state and one of the most ethnically diverse, if not the most ethnically diverse. And we're urban, and we have a lot of renters, and they are more likely to move regularly, obviously, than homeowners. So is their right to participate in their democracy and participate in the electoral process and vote less important, less sacrosanct than their wealthier counterparts throughout the state, and they need to re-register all the time just to remain a valid voter? Same-day voting makes this process that is so important to our democracy, at the crux of our democracy, more accessible. It's motherhood, fatherhood, apple pie, and it should be kind of a common sense measure, not worthy of a debate.
Well said, Assemblyman. We agree completely. Obviously, this is why we've been supporting this effort and working with the Assemblyman on this issue. This is something that's important for young voters, for Black voters and brown voters in the state of New Jersey, but all voters who benefit from this, because this is something that happens across the state. For a number of reasons, people might be left off the rolls or purged from rolls, which, as the Assemblyman said, happen more often in Black and brown communities than anywhere else. So we are so glad the Assemblyman is leading this effort, but I will turn it over now to Jesse Burns, who will have this a spirited conversation with our friends from Utah and Connecticut and how it works in their state, and how we can make sure that when we have it in New Jersey, it can go off without any problems and it'll be implemented very smoothly.
Thank you so much, Mel. And first, I'd like to start off by thanking the election officials for joining us, as well as the election officials in the audience, and acknowledging, particularly over the last couple of years, how difficult your job has been, as trust has been eroded in the work that you do every day to ensure that our democratic institutions are well run, efficient, and we cannot thank you enough for that work. We know it has not been easy, and it's disgraceful across the country, red, blue, no matter what state you're in, how much of an attack your offices have been under for no reason. I wanted to start off by introducing our guests. Really happy to have have them here. Shelly Jackson is the Deputy Director of Elections for the state of Utah. Prior to joining the Lieutenant Governor's office in the state of Utah, Shelly oversaw every stage of the election process at the county level and has earned her SEER certification from the Election Center. In 2016, she accepted the Outstanding Practice Award from the Election Center on behalf of her county office for outreach efforts that she developed and coordinated with Weber State University. These efforts were also recognized in 2019 by the EAC in the form of a Cleary Award. And then Gabe Rosenberg and Deputy Secretary of the State, Scott Bates, are joining us from Connecticut. Gabe is Chief of Staff and General Counsel for the Office of the Connecticut Secretary of the State. Previously, he managed all public-facing communications for the Office of the Secretary, including developing and implementing the messaging strategy for foreign intrusion elections, changes due to COVID-19, and the 2018 and 2020 elections. In prior roles, he was Communications Director for the Speaker of the House and the Connecticut House Democrats. Deputy Secretary of the State, Scott Bates, has served in leadership roles at the state, national, and international levels in policy development and government for over 25 years. After September 11th, Bates became the first senior policy advisor to the U.S. House of Representatives Homeland Security Committee and led a team that produced a dozen reports on homeland security issues ranging from border security to bioterrorism. Bates has been on the ground in every war zone where American troops have fought in this generation. He has worked with elected leaders and activists alike to build democratic institutions and governance structures in Iraq, Afghanistan, Bosnia, and the Persian Gulf, among others. Bates was appointed Secretary of the State and Legislative Director for Virginia Governor Douglas Wilder, and is credited for the state's ethics reforms and an unprecedented expansion and appointments of women and minorities to state boards and commissions. A really impressive wealth and expertise and range of knowledge, and we cannot thank you enough for joining us this morning. I'll start with Shelly. If you can talk a little bit about how same-day voter registration works in Utah, when you implemented it, and anything else you'd like to say about the process there.
I'm happy to. I just have a couple of slides, so I'll start that if that's okay. Great. So I'm just going to quickly go over the legislative history summary, just because I think it's interesting that it expired for a while and it was so popular that we brought it back, and then how we do it in Utah and that it's still working. So in 2014, a pilot project was passed. We have 29 counties in Utah and 8 of them participated. There were many county clerks that were very skeptical of it in the beginning. They assumed that there were just going to be people traipsing across the state on election day, registering to vote and voting in all 29 counties. If you've ever been to Utah, that would just be quite difficult anyway, because it takes hours and hours to get anywhere, but that was the fear. The pilot project went on, and it was the legislation enabled it until January of 2017, and it worked very well, but it was still kind of controversial and actually expired in 2017. And so that year, in the odd years, we do municipal elections here, and it wasn't used at all. But it actually, the clerks, some of the biggest naysayers who thought that all this fraud was going to happen, didn't happen. And so they actually worked really hard and got it brought back in 2018. And one of the sponsors was Senator Deidre Henderson, who is now Lieutenant Governor Deidre Henderson. And really exactly what the Assemblyman said. It wasn't hordes and hordes of new provisional ballots, which is how we do it in Utah, being cast. It was just that we were able to count more of the ones that were being cast. So that was exciting to see. And I think the best effect for us was that voters, it was a fail-safe. Voters who were sure that they had either registered when they got their driver's license, they were sure they had checked that box and showed up at the polls. Voters that, you know, had missed that deadline. At that time, our deadline was about 30 days out, so it was quite a ways away from election. Who, you know, got their forms in and thought they were registered, would show up at the polls. And then just also people who maybe, you know, went to a registration drive, but the form wasn't completely filled out or something. So that's really the people that it did help. In the 2016 presidential general election, 7 of 8 of the counties that were participating in that pilot project reported that it was only 1.4% of all the ballots cast that were same-day registration. So it wasn't this, you know, floodgate of people who were just, you know, not doing their due diligence and getting registered and showing up that were using it. And then in 2018, of course, we implemented it. So again, in Utah, the way we do our same-day registration is by provisional ballots. All the required registration information is taken at that time. We use a mix of, so we are a vote by mail state, but our counties at the polling places use a hybrid of, some of them do a ballot on demand where they're doing paper ballots at the polls. Some of them use ballot marking devices. Either way, it's creating a paper ballot. And so that paper ballot is getting folded into this envelope that contains all of the registration information. You do need to show 2 forms of ID. Utah is an ID state. However, there's a very long list of IDs that we do allow, so it's a little more progressive in that respect. But in order to vote provisionally, you do need to show 2 forms of ID, one that verifies your identity and one that verifies your residency, your current residency. And then of course we have a statewide voter database that makes it easier, and that's live with poll pads at the polling place. So workers are able to check that and verify things. So I think that's part of what leads to that. The way that so again, we issue these paper ballots, they get tucked into that envelope with all of the registration information. And then during the canvass period, we do process those and verify people's registration, verify their eligibility to vote, and then count their vote and add those totals to the official results. A question we get asked all the time, does that lead to later results, official results? No, because as a vote by mail state, we're already waiting for some of those by mail ballots to come in that are timely postmarked. So we're already educating our voters that that the results are not final on election day. Very rarely are they swayed. We had one very competitive congressional district that kind of would go back and forth. So it was really only in those very tight races that happens. That's just kind of an overview. I'm happy to take questions now or later.
Thanks,
I did,
Shelly.
oh, sorry. So I did send also that legislative audit. We actually had an audit done on same-day registration in 2019. I'm happy to send it out again. So our legislature did request this audit, and it focused on, was fraud possible, and it found that it was almost impossible.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shelly. We'll circulate the audit documents that were really helpful to the participants in the follow-up to this, to make sure that everybody on the line gets that. And then I think, you know, if we can turn it over to Connecticut, whoever wants to kind of go here, you know, what does it look like in your state? And maybe some of the same points, you know, election results, how do people cast ballots, these kind of things.
Sure. Well, I'll take a shot at it. I can say that we've had about 10 years of experience now with what we call EDR, election day registration, same day registration. And really, it's led to about 100,000 people being able to register and vote over those last 10 years. So, you know, we view EDR as an important tool to ensure that every eligible voter can register, can cast their ballot and make their voice heard. It's as simple as that. And we've had no issues in those 10 years. I can empathize with my colleague from Utah, because local election officials, often when they hear about changes in anything, they're a little bit nervous about that. But we've had time, and local election officials have no problem. In Connecticut, we range from the town of Union, which has 800 people, to Hartford, Stamford, New Haven, with hundreds of thousands of people. And just to share with you a story from 2018, around 7:30, polls close at 8. We were hearing of big lines in New Haven. There were hundreds of students, mostly, and some other folks in New Haven, which is, I think, a majority minority community in the state, who were lined up trying to do same-day registration because there'd been a snafu in their actual registration. They were showing up and they're like, oh, you're not registered. And, my memory of that is about 400 people in the last half hour were able to register and vote. Think of that. Those are young people that would have been turned away if they didn't have that tool. So it's a super powerful tool. I think in the 10 years that we've had it, and there are tons of safeguards. I think there's been one case where somebody tried to vote in 2 places, and that was found out. There are a lot of safeguards, and some of them, for example, are that when you go to do same-day registration in Connecticut, you have to have proof of residence of some form. There are a lot of different ways you can prove that. You take an oath. So right there, you're on the record, and you can, be held liable for that if you're making it up. There are personnel that are dedicated to the process. So when they're inputting it, these are trained election officials that know what to look for. There's a cross-check. So you actually, those local election officials in Connecticut have access to the statewide voter database and can check and see if you registered anywhere else. And then there's also a letter that goes out to your new place of registration. And if that comes back like, we don't know who that is, then state election enforcement can do an investigation and will do an investigation. So it's about access. And in Connecticut, it's been a big hit that way. We're very proud of that. And, it's about safeguards, and we have those in place to maintain the integrity of the system, which really has not been questioned.
Yeah, I think, one thing that I heard, from both of you here is about this kind of fail-safe, this safeguard, right? When you're talking about something went wrong with somebody's original registration, right? I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. I know that across the country, as we deal with more people registering and more technology and systems, that statewide voter registration databases aren't always perfect, right? And have you had experience with, same day kind of helping in these incidences, like you mentioned with these students, where maybe there was something that happened with the data itself or something like this?
I think my colleague from Connecticut may be able to point to more specific instances, but let's just start with the basic fact of everyday citizens who are holding down 2 jobs and trying to get their kids to daycare, and they're like, oh, that's right, there's a state election today, because we have this for local and state, and so it's maybe not just even a presidential day. So I mean, I've had that happen, okay, so in total candor. But Gabe was present in the legislature, working in and around the legislature when this issue moved forward in Connecticut. So he might be able to shed a lot more light on this topic. But over to you, Gabe.
Yeah, well, in 2002, I moved in October, and I was 10 years too early, and I wasn't able to. That was the only election in my life that I've missed, and it was basically just because of the time that I moved. And I'm not the only person that's happened to, and we've eliminated that as a reason why you can't vote with election day registration. The issue in 2018 in New Haven was fascinating because it was students from Yale, which is, they're not just drawing from Connecticut, obviously, they're drawing from every state in the country. And what happened, in the brave new world of mail not really existing, these college students reached out to their states to get absentee ballots. and the Yale mail service had some sort of problem there and returned the ballots without them reaching the students. So there was a number of students who, through no fault of their own, on election day realized that they were not going to be able to vote if Connecticut didn't have election day registration, because they could have received their ballot up until election day in many states and got it postmarked and it would have been fine. So they kind of descended on New Haven City Hall when they realized that they weren't getting their absentee ballots. We've had similar problems across the state, whether it's absentee ballots or if it's people who thought that they registered and did not completely register. One thing that I want to point out is that, unlike what it sounds like Utah and it does and what New Jersey might do, is we don't do it in the polling place. We do it in town hall. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Primarily, Connecticut has a culture of making it so that provisional ballots are not ever needed. So we have a closed loop central voter registration system in every town hall in Connecticut, and it basically replaced our old system of having a quote unquote presidential ballot in the presidential years. Now the town halls are open. It's almost like a polling place. You bring the same documentation you would need to bring if you were just registering to vote in the traditional way 3 weeks before the election or what have you, and you're able to get your ballot right there and cast it at town hall in the EDR location. And part of that is because during the legislative history in Connecticut, the registrars, and we have 2 registrars in each of our 100, we have no counties, so each of our 169 towns has 2 registrars, 1 of each party. The registrars, the feedback that came at the time was that they'd be much more comfortable if it was happening in one location than if it was happening at each polling place. They didn't want to do provisional ballots because of our political history, and it was kind of cost prohibitive to drop a closed central voter registration line in each of our 800 polling places. So based on our political culture, it developed in a slightly different way than it has in other places.
Yes, and I think in Utah, one of the things was the provisional ballots of people who showed up at the polling place who weren't registered. Sometimes it was because they were just registered in another county and the polling place could only see within their own county. I think, and they were not always we found adjudicated the same across the counties. So that was another thing, like maybe one county was saying, oh, I found during the canvass period, I found that person, they were actually registered in Utah, and other counties were, maybe not doing that. At the time, our motor voter, people could register at the DMV or here the driver's license division, but that was before everything was automated. And so literally clerks were driving to the DMV once a week and picking up paper forms, and they weren't always making it, back to the office from the DMV timely. So some of them were missing the registration date. So this just really was a fail-safe. And the way that we market it here, and we do have some critics of it, is that we always advertise to people, it's just easier to get your ballot in the mail since we are vote by mail. Just register. We've moved the registration date closer to the election. It's now 11 days out. Get registered. And then we kind of tell people, as that date gets closer and as that date is passed on the phone, don't worry, just go to the polls. We got you. So we kind of change our messaging at that point. And I know that there are a lot of groups that wish we would just be more open and transparent about the same day registration, but it has definitely been the clerk's prerogative to try to get everyone that ballot in the mail first.
Great, Shelly. And I see that, some folks have been popping some questions and answers for you in the chat. Maybe we can just go through them in case other folks are also interested. There was a question about, when did your legislation first pass? How much time was given between the passage of the legislation and the first pilot to prepare election officials and train poll workers, which I think we should all come back to in a second about training and that kind of thing. And how were counties selected for the pilot? And then the second part is, what is Utah's requirement on the receipt of vote by mail?
Thank you. So yes, so I'm trying to remember. I think the legislation passed and then it was open the next election cycle. I don't remember there being, that's right about the time, 2014, that I started at counties and working in the election office. So it did, we have a very good clerks group here. We have the Utah Association of Clerks. And so my recollection, and I hope it's true, is that they kind of worked with the legislators to implement this. Some of them really thought, you know what, we just are having, when we go to canvass and we have to report the number of provisional ballots, there's just this huge, 50, 60% that we don't count for reasons. And one of the ways that we think we can get this number down and count more is to do this. So I think the clerks worked it and just decided originally they would do it by provisional ballot. They were already doing that. We've always been training our poll workers to say, don't turn people away, let them vote provisionally. We don't want you to have to be the person that says, you can't vote. So for whatever reason, whether they're marked as already voted, whatever, let them vote by provisional ballot. We'll sort it out. We'll call them afterwards and be the bad guy. So there wasn't a lot of training. And I think that was already just, I assume they were looking at other states to see how they were doing it too. But I think that was just kind of a natural progression. There, of course, were a few clerks that were like, absolutely not, I'm not participating. It was voluntary. So clerks had by a certain date to let the lieutenant governor's office know that they were going to participate in it. And we did have kind of a range of counties. The county that I started at that year participated in it. And so we were tracking numbers, and those numbers are all reported in that legislative audit. And I forgot the other question. Oh, the postmark deadline. So vote by mail ballots must be clearly postmarked by the day before election. So it's always the Monday before election. If we receive it we can receive the ballots anytime through the day before we report the canvass. And once election day has passed, we have to be able to read that postmark under Utah law. So if it's smudged, unfortunately, sometimes we're not able to count it, but it is the day before, and vote by mail ballots can be dropped off in person through 8 p.m. the close of polls.
I wanted to mention something about training and personnel, and how do the local election officials know what to do. In Connecticut, registrars of voters, which Gabe mentioned, we have one Republican, one Democrat for each town. They go through a certification process to hold their position. So, one of the modules of their training, which is all online now, includes, EDR, same day registration. So it doesn't mean it always is perfectly implemented, but again, we really haven't heard too many problems. And this is a nice reminder for our office to probably do a brush up online training before we start in again, but it is something that they have to know.
Do you recall kind of the runway basically between same day passage in Connecticut and implementation? And I mean, for our system would look, as proposed, look more similar to Utah, where we would start with provisional ballots and polling locations using the existing structure. So training would be a little bit different because poll workers are already trained on provisional ballots. The election official side on counting and how to do that might look a little bit different. But in Connecticut, do you recall kind of like the runway between?
Yeah, it passed. It passed in 2012, which would have made it, at worst May of 2012. The first election was 2013 in November. That being said, we have municipal elections in the odd number years, and they, unsurprisingly, have dramatically less turnout. So the first year of EDR, there were 2,000 people who used election day registration. That was in a low turnout municipal year. So the first, I don't want to say real, but the first real election, like in terms of turnout, was 2014, and there were 14,000 people. So that'll show you kind of the difference between the two. So there was basically a year and a half lead up to the first municipal election, 2.5 years from passage to the first statewide election. The other thing about Connecticut that makes the lead up a little bit interesting, or not interesting, but like makes it a little easier for the smaller towns. We have 169 towns, and about 100 of them, maybe 90 of them have only one polling place. So when you have only one polling place, it tends to be in the town hall, which is the exact same location that you're doing the election day registration. So while we don't do it in the polling place, and they are separate in the town halls, for all of our smaller towns, it is in the same place. And it's basically combining the process of registration, which are done by the registrars anyway, with the process of voting, which are done by people that are hired by the registrars. So because we don't use provisional ballots, really, it made it a very smooth transition because it was just combining two processes that they had already been doing.
This might be a little bit more wonky, so, you know, forgive me if nobody has this at hand. It's a data question, but, you know, you mentioned a little bit about numbers. With the exception of presidential, is it kind of a steady use of same day that you see in your states, or are there big like blips? I guess it probably depends on the election, or Shelly?
I think it holds steady. The one number I have handy is that 2016 election was, our audit reported 1.4% of all the ballots were same day registration. That was a presidential year. Like I said, I think the provisional ballots are the same. It just depends on the election and how popular that is. But yeah, we have not seen a significant spike.
I don't believe that we have a way of comparing it apples to apples because Connecticut does not have vote by mail except with a strict excuse, and does not have early voting, both of which we're working on. But because of COVID, in the 2016 election, we had 35,000 people use EDR. In the 2020 election, we had 22,000. And I think a lot of that difference, even though they're both presidential elections with both fairly high turnouts, a lot of that difference is that in 2020, more people, because of COVID, were allowed to vote by absentee ballot. So it kind of dramatically changed the EDR usage. And then, you know, even our municipal races, which you would think, even though they're low turnout, you can compare them as an apples to apples comparison. You really can't, because there's towns like Hartford, for example, that I'm sitting in right now, that has, you know, every 4 years they have a mayoral election. And in that off-year municipal election, they essentially have almost nothing on the ballot. So there'll be, you know, every 2 years you'll have turnout in one of Connecticut's largest cities where the turnout's like 1%, because the only thing that's on the ballot is a school board race that was really decided in the primary. So it's really hard to make an apples to apples comparison, but my guess is that if you were able to hold all things equal, you would end up with a pretty steady rate.
Hannah, is there anything that you think I'm missing? They covered so many of the questions that we hear most often that have to do with kind of, you know, election results, implementation, the real world practicality of implementing this in the county election official office. Is there anything that you think that I didn't raise?
Just a broad question. I know, I mean, we kind of touched on this here. You know, voting rights and election process is always under scrutiny. And I will echo what Jesse said earlier, that we are so grateful to election officials both in New Jersey and around the country, because we know your jobs were already tough and have become tougher in the last few years. And our government, our democracy wouldn't work without you. But beyond that, beyond the general scrutiny everyone receives, how has same day work, has it been popular with voters, with election officials, you know, and especially election officials and also elected officials? Is this something that actually is something people appreciate now, or is it still something where there's some hiccups? And another related question, how long did it take to get to, if everyone's okay with it?
I can say in Connecticut that it's been embraced by elected officials. Local officials just view it as part of their job. It's pretty non-controversial at this point. And, you know, anytime we can make things easier for voters, it's a good day. Just point to, I mean, Gabe mentioned that we have a lot of kind of strictures on our absentee balloting. But because those were loosened during COVID, we went from 5% absentee to 35%. And so, you know, that tells you that people are in need of ways to access their God-given constitutional right to vote. And this is simply another tool to get to that place. So it's been popular with voters.
Agreed. And I think especially in this climate, when a clerk has to we are required to send letters to people whose ballots didn't count after the election. So I think it's been very popular among clerks to not have to deliver that news and to let voters know, don't worry, we counted your ballot, especially with the narrative of you're doing everything you can to not count my ballot. That this has been a nice counter to that.
If anybody has any questions from the audience, please feel free to use the question and answer. Our audience is the folks who are in charge of our elections here in New Jersey. They know the ins and outs of everything we do, so they're very an audience full of experts, as well as legislators and their staff. So around policy, happy to take any questions that you all have. We did lift up questions that folks gave us ahead of time, and that's how we kind of made sure that we were able to pose those to the election officials. Not seeing anything. Does anybody want to have any closing thoughts?
I think it's time for Jersey to move forward with this. Don't be afraid. And, you know, I'd say that Connecticut and New Jersey are fairly similar demographically. You might think of Connecticut as like Ralph Lauren polo ads, but we're not. Get off the highway and see the rest of the state. And you know, as I said, it's a kind of a lot of different kind of localities. It's been working here, and voters like it.
I actually do have a question, and I don't know if you all would know this answer, and if you don't, that's fair. Do you know that if one same day was implemented, did it lead to candidates, any party, any level, having to change how they campaign?
Yes, a little. The effects are more on the margins, right? Because it's hard when you're talking about voters who aren't registered, it's harder to know like what a quote unquote likely voter would be. But that being said, there's always, the day after our registration deadline is 7 days before the election. So the day after that, our office always tells people, well, if you forgot to register, this is how you could do it on election day. But campaigns will also do that and kind of push people towards election day registration if they've identified voters that are not registered that are likely to vote for them. I think that sometimes it's the perception is that it's the Democratic Party that benefits from this. But my experience has not been that. I think it is more that the voters who move a lot are the ones who benefit from that a lot, regardless of what party they support. And we have an entire swath of Eastern Connecticut where there might be people who are moving, and they're not necessarily Democrats. So both parties, I think, have made a concerted effort to try and identify those voters, particularly in close races where a couple of voters can make the difference.
I'll share a story with you from another place and another time. In the late 90s, I was working on a campaign in Wisconsin, and it was a congressional primary. And the polling had my candidate ahead by maybe 1%, something like this. It was pretty consistent. We're feeling good, 1 or 2%. And then all of a sudden we lost because 5,000 young people voted at the University of Wisconsin. They have same-day registration. I didn't know what that was back then. And, that woman that beat us is named Tammy Baldwin, and she went on to be a US Senator. And, shame on me for not knowing the law at the time, but really that allowed that voice to be heard that day. And those were in the late 90s, young citizens who they can now point to that and say they know they made the difference that day.
And I think in Utah, we heard a lot of Republicans say, oh my gosh, this is going to bring out all the Democrats. They're going to come out at the last minute. But I think you're missing a key thing. You have to have Democratic voters. We have 60%. We're one party state for the most part. Demographics are slowly changing in Utah, but at a very glacial pace. So you have to have those voters. We heard that with vote by mail. Oh no, all the Democrats who are too lazy to go to the polls are going to vote. Again, you have to have those voters in your districts and in your state. So it just brings out the voters you have. And I think everyone who wants to vote should have that opportunity regardless.
you know, we either believe in democracy or we don't. And people can try to game a system, but that's archly cynical at the end of the day. And I say that as a former campaign manager, especially at this time in history. We have to trust people and we have to hear their voice.
Agreed.
Well said. We could not agree more. And that's why we have the campaign here in New Jersey, the Democracy in a Day campaign, which we've been advocating for this, and Assemblyman Mukherji has been leading the way on this. And I don't know, Jesse or the Assemblyman, if you have any last minute words, last things to say as we wrap up.
I would just thank the participants from Utah and Connecticut for your time in sharing these insights. You know, it just, I think, buttresses and underscores the points that we're making, that this really is not a, it's not a partisan thing. It doesn't advantage, you know, any ideological cause one way or another. It's just advances participation in democracy. And if there's, by extension, an advantage that inures to any group of people, that's because that's already there, like you just described in Utah. So I just want to thank everyone for their participation. I'm hopeful that we can overcome some of the misconceptions about this, and how easy it is and how it ultimately won't actually be very disruptive, because while we're going to have a slight uptick in participation in the electoral process, we hope, and turnout as a result of this, the numbers are actually small. It's not going to sway any election. It doesn't stand a chance of doing that. It's just going to allow a few more people to have their vote count when they go to the polls. And that is what democracy should be all about. That's all. And thank you to the advocates as always.
Thank you so much, Assemblyman. And thank you to the election officials. And thank you to our audience for joining us this morning. We consider this an open dialogue. If you have questions, I'm sure that our participants here would be willing to take your questions later. We can shoot them over to them. As you think through this legislation as amended, if you haven't seen the amended legislation, please reach out to the Assemblyman. We can show you what the amendments are on the proposed legislation so you have a clear idea. Learned a lot. Thank you so much for attending, everybody. And again, consider this an open dialogue, and I cannot thank you enough for spending your Friday morning with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
All right.